Hey guys, welcome to By the Horns, a Bitcoin podcast about South Africa. In today's episode, I spoke to Dr. Jonathan Witt. Now, most of you might know Dr. Jonathan. He was one of the founders of the Renegade Report podcast, quite a well-known, outspoken South African character. But he's been very outspoken about COVID for the last 2 years and has taken a huge amount of flack because of that. So in this episode, we got into the myths of COVID and what his stance has been, what he's been right about, what he's been wrong about. Spoiler alert, he's been right about most things. But more importantly, the persecution that Jonathan has suffered because of this, both professionally and his personal capacity, have been quite high. But nonetheless, he stuck to his principles and he's been taking a stand on things like bodily autonomy, etc. So we dived into a bunch of things like, do masks work, fomite versus aerosol spread. We even got into vaccines, all of that stuff. That's pretty light on Bitcoin. We spoke about Bitcoin for about 15 minutes at the end of the show because it can't have a podcast without that on By the Horns. But if you are not particularly interested in COVID, you're tired of it, I get it, then maybe this episode is not for you. But if you want to hear from what I would refer to as an expert and an honest expert at that, then this is a great one. Spoiler, his Bitcoin is not, the thing that he spends most of his time on. So if you are looking for a Bitcoin heavy discussion, then this is not going to be the one. But I found it super interesting. It was 2.5 hours long. I had a really good time. And I think Jonathan is fundamentally a very honest and principled person and has taken a lot of flack for that. And the price of truth is high. But yeah, my hat's off to him for saying what he's been saying. And, he's been right most of the time about this. So if you enjoy this, like and subscribe. Enjoy the show. Video. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to By the Horns, a Bitcoin podcast about South Africa. I'm your host, Ricky Allardyce. By the Horns is brought to you proudly by Bitwise, the only place to buy self-custody Bitcoin in South Africa. And this evening, we're joined by someone who's been a long-standing contrarian in the South African media landscape, one of the OG podcasters in South Africa, certainly someone who gave me inspiration to start a podcast. He is a liberal in the true sense of the word, in that live and let live, a stickler for principles, maybe sometimes to his own detriment. Jonathan Witt, Dr. Jonathan Witt, welcome to the show.
How's it, Ricky?
Lekker, man. Good to have you.
It was a proper Joburg twang on that, eh? Proper how's it?
It's a Bernardsdorp twang, actually. But Jonathan, welcome to the show. For those people who don't know, you had a podcast called The Renegade Report, which sadly has come to an end, but the WhatsApp group lives on very strongly. Maybe you want to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself. For those who lived under a rock and don't know who you are.
No, look, I'm sure there's many people who have no idea who I am, which is perfectly fine. What's sad is that, the still on as it is, but that's a discussion maybe for another day. I'm a medical doctor by profession, specialist anesthesiologist. And besides that, I get involved in a whole bunch of stuff. So as you mentioned, the Renegade Report was something that took up a fair amount of my time for about 3.5 years. It was the country's most downloaded weekly podcast for about 2 of those 3 years and always in the top 10 for the entire time that we did it. It grew really fantastically. And I think, in fairness, that it probably catapulted a whole bunch of other podcasts into the realm, certainly into the discussion space, and gave people confidence perhaps to do their own thing and to see if it works, some of which have done very well. And I'm quite proud of that. The Renegade Report itself was, I think, a good show. Ramon and I, obviously Ramon's gone on to do The Morning Shot, which is a great daily podcast, and really he wants to build that into something even greater than that, and I'm sure he will. Others have obviously followed suit, and I think that's what's really important. We opened that discussion space when the story. I'm not sure if people who don't know won't have heard it before, but the story is that we originally pitched the Renegade Report. We're told we could do 6 episodes. We're told that it will get maybe 300 to 500 listeners, and basically that will be the ceiling. When we blew through a couple of thousand downloads after the second or third episode, that's when obviously there was knowledge and understanding that this was something that was sorely needed. And in a South African environment where so much of the legacy media space is dominated by essentially left-wing thinking and a certain politic and a certain ideology. It's really important to have alternative media at this stage, which is filling the gap on at least telling a different side. Certainly not at the same volume, unfortunately, but time will tell.
So just walk me through that, how it got started. So you obviously were hosted on Cliff Central. And so you guys pitched this to Gareth Cliff, who is quite a center right leaning guy himself, right? Or at least he's pro free speech. Did he not think the idea would have legs because he just didn't think there was an appetite for right wing views in the South African discourse?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting to call Gareth center right. I mean, I think by any definition, and anyone who doesn't maybe listen to Gareth anymore, but listened to him once on 5FM and thought, hey, his politics are probably a bit lefty. I mean, this is a guy who rooted against George Bush. So he's hardly a Republican in the American, a conservative in the American definition, pro-abortion. I know they don't like saying that pro-choice, but the truth is pro-abortion. He 20 years ago would easily have been called someone who was center left. And it's just interesting how that shifted. And I suppose in today's environment, he certainly would be considered center right just because he believes in free speech, he believes in free choice, he believes in a free market. So, but yeah, we pitched to him and his business partner Rena, and it wasn't sort of disparaging in any way. They gave us the space. I'd known Gareth for a very long time, actually. We came into contact originally at SABC in the mid 2000s and first met each other. Listeners of his show will remember when he interviewed Jesus because Mel Gibson released The Passion of the Christ, and Gareth used the opportunity. I'm sure the sort of backstory is something to the effect of 5FM said, look, it's a big movie, we've got to do something about it on the show. And Gareth said, not a problem, I'll interview Jesus. Obviously, that wasn't run past management.
I think that guy's name is Bruce Marciano, right? The actor who actually played Jesus in that
yeah,
movie.
But he didn't interview Bruce Marciano or Jesus. He just interviewed himself, pretending to be actual Jesus.
It's a good troll.
So, yeah, sorry, it's the first day of summer up here in Joburg, so I'm just going to have some water. So he did that, and they suspended him. And I was so disgusted by this at the time that, and of course the media did what the media do. They reported Gareth Cliff's been suspended. There was no sort of, well, what the hell? We have a constitution. We have freedom of speech. This is literally the state broadcaster suspending someone for having freedom of expression in doing like a skit, essentially. And I wrote to the SABC board. I actually wrote a letter, and it was quite a harsh letter that I wrote to them, basically criticizing them, saying that they were in violation of basic principles of liberalism and the Constitution, and that they should be ashamed of themselves, essentially. I didn't think that letter would go anywhere, by the way, but apparently it found its way to the board meeting, and they were none too happy about that. Of course, Gareth then found out about the letter, and that's we knew each other from before, but we then sort of got on more friendly terms. And so when he left 5FM, I had been at the time for about 2 years or so. I'd been doing a short segment on his show, which was a medical segment, but because of the type of show it was always meant to be more entertaining than informing. So the one show that I got into trouble for was talking about the delivery of Kate and William's first child, George. And the day before that, I had live tweeted as if I was in the room. One of the tweets was something to the effect of, William has just fainted. He's been to war, but he's never seen anything like this before. Those were the sentiments of the tweets, as if I was in the room. And it was kind of a series of tweets back in the day when Twitter was actually funny and humorous.
Yeah.
And so the next day I went on the show and we sort of discussed childbirth, and we discussed aspects of childbirth in a comical way, but also in an honest way, because childbirth is messy and painful and all those things. And so that was quite controversial. I rubbed some people up the wrong way, apparently, and I was in the Daily Maverick the day that followed. Obviously, because Branko's not a particularly ethical person, in my view, without right of reply. But that sort of kicked off our relationship. And when he started Cliff Central, I said, well, I know you're starting all these shows. Let me come do a medical show. And I did a medical show for a couple of years there. Interesting little side note is that I kind of lost interest in the medical show after a while, simply because radio-based or podcast-based sort of flat medical shows like that are very difficult to do, in the sense that you either have to prepare a topic and then it's very hard to make it user-friendly, especially for an hour, or you've got to have people kind of calling in with issues, and then you've got to have discussions. But of course, that wasn't what the platform lent itself to. So I did that for about 2 odd years, and then I sort of started roping in someone people will know very well, who's subsequently sadly passed away, but Cindi van Zyl. Cindi van Zyl at the time was an unknown. I don't even think she had a Twitter account. And I had known her because I had met her originally working at Baragwanath Hospital. And I gave her a call and I said, Cindi, I'm getting sort of tired of doing this medical show, and don't you want to come and give it a bash? So she came in and she came on a show with me, I think, and then subsequently took it over, and she did that for a little while. And look, she really enjoyed it and made a thing of it. And that's how she ended up branching out into various radio and television sort of segments ultimately, and making a real name for herself. So yeah, that was the kind of evolution. And then I was over the medical show and I came across this guy by the name of Ramon Cabernac, who was really just a troll. There's no other way to describe him. Just a troll.
I mean,
Twitter.
He still is. Not much has changed.
No, completely. I mean, he's no Michael Mellis, but he tries. And he's going to love this. Anyway, but he and I, he started off trolling me, and then I sort of thought, this guy seems okay. So we sort of started talking to each other, and he sort of said, he'd love to do something political. And I said, yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I'm obviously quite interested in that side of things. Why don't we do a podcast? And we sort of came up with an idea. It wasn't very well formed, I have to say. Our pitch wasn't great. It's going to be Jonathan and Ramon talking about politics. And at the time, there was sort of Fees Must Fall that was going on. That was very much in the news. A lot of that type of rhetoric, those types of politics, Julius Malema, obviously. And we sort of came and said, well, we want to be the opposite of that. We want to sort of fight against that and talk about those issues from the classically liberal perspective. I say that from my perspective. Ramon at the time was an anarchist, so he wanted to talk about it from the anarchist perspective. But certainly both of those were not things that were well covered in terms of a principled base. And we pitched it and we said, look, this is what we want to do. And as I say, they said, we'll give you the studio, we'll give you the airtime, we'll do it, but let's try 6, because, it doesn't seem as if Gareth was a bit more keen than Rena. I think just to shake the cage more than anything else at the time. But Rena, has an extensive history. Those who work in media will know her. At one point in her career, the station manager at 702. So she's no slouch, and she's been around. And she just didn't think that it had legs. And it did. And obviously we tapped into something that otherwise nobody knew was really there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I found you guys probably... I just started working, and I was driving from Muizenberg to Stellenbosch every day. And I remember driving on the coastal road on Baden Powell, and for my first day of work, and I turned on the radio. And about half an hour in, I was like, no, this will not do. This is no way to spend like 2 hours of your day listening to fucking radio. So I started looking for like local podcasts, and I was already into like the classical liberal anarchist kind of thing. And I was like, where do I find, is there anything in South Africa like this? And I mean, I think you guys are maybe like 7-8 episodes in when I found you guys, so it's quite early. But just finding like the caliber of content being produced in South Africa, it was blowing my mind, because there's nothing else coming out of South Africa remotely that was touching like on those topics. No one was speaking about it. Nothing in the mainstream media was touching it. Definitely not on radio. So it was great to find those ideas being put out there, and then obviously the gravity that podcast had to attract people around it. And it's like that's basically, that podcast is what got me through lockdown, because of the group that's formed around it, and just being able to sit in, like I was down in Strathspey during lockdown in the middle of nowhere. And to be able to be on a WhatsApp group with other people and be like, do you guys think cloth masks work? Like, what do you guys think?
Should I not go to the beach? Because, am I going to get COVID on the beach? An empty beach.
Yeah, this sounds like bullshit to me. Like, have a sounding board, and everyone on the group is like, no, this is bullshit, guys. So, like, that was a big deal. And thank you for that, because having that sounding board has been great. Because now, as we know, sitting here in February of 2020, all of that was bullshit. So this is a good segue into COVID. Because I remember very clearly from the start, maybe not from the start, but maybe everyone was a bit worried, like when Italy happened, right? We saw that propaganda coming out of Italy, and we were like, maybe there's cause for concern. Fair enough, treat it carefully. But then, a couple of weeks in, I think this is when you started raising red flags, and maybe you want to take it from there. Like, what were you saying in the early days of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's important to say that I didn't get everything right, but I think I got close, and I do consider myself to have gotten closer than almost anyone else. Certainly in South Africa, there are others, people like Nick Hudson at Panda and other members of
He's going to be on the show next week, actually, incidentally.
Oh, that'll be excellent.
Absolutely.
There are others overseas who've done very good work. Big names like Scott Atlas comes to mind, and Jay Bhattacharya, Sunetra Gupta. There are those, but in January and up to about mid-Feb, those who make troll accounts on Twitter love to remind me of one or two tweets in January and in February, early Feb, which said something to the effect of, this isn't going to be too much of a big deal, it'll pass. Look, there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that I've seen this before. And they tried to do this with swine flu in 2008-9, and they failed. And I think the reason it failed then, I actually think they could have succeeded in the same way they have. And they is a whole bunch of actors we can talk about. But I think they could have succeeded, but I think social media didn't exist. And there's an important part of the feedback loop that wasn't there. And as a result, couldn't create the environment to do what we've done. And then we had Zika, and a lot of people forget Zika, but the Brazilian Olympic Games was almost cancelled because of Zika, because Zika was going to go to the United States, and all these babies were going to be born with misshapen heads, and it was going to be terrible, and all the rest of it. And then they started coming out, because Zika can affect certain kids and certain pregnancies. Then they started coming out with, well, we actually think it affects the women as well, and maybe it can be transferred to men. And then there was a whole bunch of stuff about fertility there, and they sort of started this like rolling snowball, and then it disappeared. And I just looked at SARS-CoV-2 at the time when I wrote these tweets. That's also the important context. The disease had not been named. We had a virus called SARS-CoV-2, and we did not have anything called COVID-19. COVID-19 came about quite quickly when Trump started calling it the China virus. Then they had to come up with a name that was politically correct and wouldn't upset Xi Jinping, who is essentially the reason for the person who is head of the WHO being the head of the WHO. And I based on history, looked at that and thought, look, this will be a passing fad. News stories, even big stories, tend to pass after about 10 days. The biggest stories in the world, you can track it. There'll be front page news day 1, 2, and 3, and then they slowly slip back, bottom of the page, page 2, page 3. And usually by day 10, they're gone. And those are massive things. I remember tracking this for Princess Diana's death. Because it was a concept that my father and I discussed many years back. And the same story with her. She actually exceeded it. I think she went to about 12 days in the news, her death, and then that was it. Obviously it was a passing story every now and again, and it was a update here and there, but not head of the news. And so I looked at this and thought, well, even if there's a virus, what will happen is there'll be a virus, and we'll deal with it, because that's not your problem. That's not the journalist's problem. That's not an engineer's problem. That's not a 3-year-old child's problem. That's my problem. I work in a hospital. I'm going to have to solve that problem, and other doctors are going to have to solve that problem, and we will solve that problem, and we'll deal with it as best as we can, just like we deal with mass casualty incidents as best we can, just like we deal with average Friday nights as best we can, and just like we deal with day-to-day stuff, everything from flu to cancer, as best we can. And so up until about mid-Feb, that was my view. And then I started seeing this sort of narrative being woven. And it was everywhere, and it was the same. And that was when I realized this wasn't going anywhere, because when every news channel, not only internationally but locally, is almost reporting identically, using often the same words, in the same sentences, which are not generic sentences. They shouldn't be generic sentences, using the same footage, using the same pictures, and also amplifying clear, outright Chinese propaganda. People like to forget the videos of people just falling over in the street in China, allegedly being struck down by COVID. We've seen that. We haven't seen that repeated anywhere else in the world. We know people get sick and die from COVID, obviously.
We've seen it on soccer fields.
Sure, a separate thing. But we've seen no people walking in the streets in New York, no people walking in the street in Johannesburg, no people walking in the street in Sydney and just falling over and dying. And so, that was obviously a lie. We saw the Chinese going through streets with these tankers full of basically chlorine, and spraying streets and buildings. And that never made sense to me. I couldn't understand what they were doing, but that's what we saw.
Welding doors shut. Remember that?
Yeah, welding doors shut. Sure, insane. Using drones to chase people back into their houses. So, that sort of started happening. And the problem is the Western media started amplifying that. And then there was a turning point. And bearing in mind, when this is all going on, you still have Nancy Pelosi telling people to go to Chinatown and enjoy Chinese New Year. You have people calling Donald Trump racist for putting in a travel ban against China, which, as it happened, was too late. So it did end up pointless, but racist, not at all. And, you basically, until the beginning of March, nobody in the public eye had really identified a problem. And I think you're right. I think many people then started looking at those pictures out of Italy and going, okay, there must be some sort of issue here. And I was no different on that. I looked at that and said, all right, I think that it's very likely that some of my colleagues or myself are going to die from this, because we had heard in the medical space that there had been a couple of ear, nose, and throat surgeons and a couple of anesthetists who had died, and the thought was that they'd been in a theater with a patient who had COVID, and that they'd aerosolized COVID into the theater, not been wearing any kind of PPE, and as a result, had all got COVID and died. And that was the sort of original story. I still don't know if there was any absolute truth to that story. I'm sure there were doctors who obviously passed away, but I don't know how true that story was. So there wasn't a complete dismissal, and there wasn't no concern. But the alarm bells started going off for me when I saw the ideas people were having about what to do with this whole scenario. And the real issue came in when Neil Ferguson from Imperial College put together a whole bunch of modeling. And that modeling is still wrong to this day.
By orders of magnitude.
Said at the time, yes, by several orders of magnitude, even now when we've had more time to allow that to happen. So to give you an idea, he said in the United Kingdom by the end of 2020, there would be 500,000 deaths. And he said in the United States, there would have been 2 million by the end of 2020. And, if you go back and look at what the figures were on the 1st of January 2021, you'll see that he was completely wrong.
Yeah.
Neil Ferguson was known to me because he has been wrong on everything he's ever done, pretty much.
It's the world's worst modeler.
Well, he's
Like
not
how
the world's
anyone...
worst modeler. He's a modeler. And this is the problem, is that modeling is what crystal balls are to mystic healers. It's the science version of crystal balls. And so sometimes you will get sort of into the ballpark if what you put in is roughly correct to what's going to come out. But if you put bullshit in, bullshit out. And so modeling can have major issues. And the big problem with modeling is when you don't understand the variables, then you have to start guessing. We didn't know the variables at the time for COVID, so they were guessing at IFRs and CFRs, case fatality rates and incident fatality rates. And because they were guessing, they came out with these terrible numbers. And then, of course, they amplified the numbers by taking them over a time duration. This is the same thing that happens with climate change modeling. And he was wrong, but it doesn't matter that he was wrong, because to this day, nothing has happened to him. He doesn't even have reputational damage. So I will say things like this, but he is still being paid by the same people who paid him before the pandemic. He's still earning the same salary, to the best of my knowledge. He's still got the same prestige. He's still a professor. Nothing has changed for this guy for getting it wrong. But what happened was that Imperial report went to 10 Downing Street and it went to the White House. And because it came from Imperial College, and because it was Neil Ferguson, and because this man carries a lot of stature, they then ran with it. And to his credit, although I don't like giving this man any credit, Boris Johnson at the time did not want to believe it. So if you recall, England originally was on the side of let's try and go for natural immunity here.
The Sweden route, right?
Basically, the Sweden route. And I think I might need to elaborate on that a little bit, because people like to straw man what that means. The US, however, and Europe had obviously freaked out. Donald Trump, who everyone says doesn't listen to anyone around him, very much did listen to the people around him. Unfortunately, they were the wrong people who were making the wrong decisions and who were giving him the wrong advice. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, first 3 weeks, first 2 months, whatever it is for you, the 15 days, the 14 days to slow the spread, the 21 days of lockdown to prepare the hospitals, whatever it is that you bought into. A lot of people say, look, I bought into that because it made sense. We didn't know much at the time. We were trying to stop a crisis, and it kind of seemed to make sense, and it wasn't that big a cost. And you're probably right. You're probably right. Had we shut down the world for 2 or 3 weeks, or even a month or two, probably would have been fine. It would have done minimal damage. But that's not what happened, obviously. And we find ourselves closing in on 2 years later. In pretty much the same position we were in March of 2020. Sure, there's been loosening of restrictions, but a lot of terrified people now exist that never existed before. Those restrictions are going to disappear, and you're still going to see people wearing masks. You're still going to see people standing 1.5 meters from you. People are still too scared to hug their own family in some places. There's a lot of damage that has been done, some of which is tangible and some of which is intangible, and we may not see the effects of for decades until really, really bad things start happening. Just the context I wanted to give to the herd immunity was the straw man of herd immunity is that we just wanted to let it rip. Those of us who supported that sort of approach in the beginning, we just wanted to carry on with life and pretend like there was no virus, and whatever happened because we're heartless. And that couldn't be further from the truth. The truth is that we early on knew that COVID-19 is a disease which predominantly affects elderly people. Predominantly. That doesn't mean only, but it means predominantly. We early on knew that this was not a disease that generally affects children. Again, generally. Are there instances, very rare, but instances nevertheless where it can? Sure. When you are dealing at population levels of public health, you are not focusing on the one child who might catch this and die. And you are not focusing on entire groups, you are focusing on the risk groups. So the entire hypothesis is that you would have turned around and said, look, this is something that we're very worried about anyone over the age of 70, or we're very worried about anyone over the age of 60. You can pick your number. 70 would have been, in my opinion, the right number. And we're also worried about diabetics, and we're also worried about hypertensives, and we're also worried about the people who've had cardiac stents and who needed cardiac surgery, etc. We're worried about those groups. We need to do all of these things with those groups. So we need to lock them down as far as is possible. We need to reduce their contact with other people as far as is possible. We need to make sure they're in ventilated areas as far as is possible. All of these things would have been a reasonable thing to do with that population. Would you have stopped that population from dying? No, there still would have been many people that probably would have succumbed, especially given what we saw in places like New York, places like Michigan, where once it was in an old age home, it went through the old age home like wildfire, and it killed off, in the New York example, apparently around 12,000 elderly people died in nursing homes.
Yeah.
Now, so you wouldn't have been able to stop it perfectly, but you may have been able to, if you focused, you may have been able to reduce that number far more. And then what would have happened is your kids, your teenagers, your young adults, all healthy, would have got it, mostly would have been fine. Yes, there would have been tragic loss, but it would have been in a very small number of people. And in so doing, you would have saved a larger group, being the elderly, who is the vulnerable population and the unhealthy population that you are trying to protect. And that was the whole principle. And unfortunately, there really is only one place that did that, and that is Sweden. It's important to note that, again, there's a straw man that goes around that Sweden did have a lockdown. That isn't untrue. There were certain things that Sweden did. So they did, for example, stop large gatherings. They had restrictions on crowd sizes at different times in the pandemic. If I recall, it was 250 at one point, 500 at another point, and then at around 2,500. But I stand to be corrected on those exact numbers. But they did limit those gatherings. But they didn't limit the average individual's life. And they certainly did not target children at any point in this pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, so obviously we're now looking back 2 years, and it's been fucking horrific what the response has been. And what I want to do is just work through a couple of the high level points of the narratives, and get your take on it. So let's kick it off with my favorite one: cloth masks prevent the spread of COVID. Obviously now the mainstream media has come out and they're like, the CDC is admitting. I think the director was saying it's nothing more than facial decoration a couple of weeks back. Obviously, this is something we've been saying from March, April in 2020, because you just had to go and read the existing literature on cloth masks to know that it didn't work. But that's my take on it. I mean, what's your stance on cloth masks?
Well, it's not much different. I need to caveat this at this point by saying that this is not medical advice from me. This is my personal opinion, which I express as a free citizen of this country under the Bill of Rights. So my personal opinion is that given the evidence we had in early 2020, which came from years, in fact, decades of doing studies on this, we knew that masks were never a thing we should force the public to wear. There really hadn't been any talk about fabric or cloth masks, because mostly you would have been laughed to COVID if you had said someone should wear that type of mask. The WHO themselves had a preparation plan for a pandemic, and that plan itself was very clear, talking about surgical masks, in fact, that these would be worn by healthcare providers, but not by the public. In 2020, up until around May, June of 2020, Anthony Fauci himself was on several mainstream networks in the United States, and there are clips, you can look them up, of him saying that nobody should wear masks, and that they are not effective and that they will not help. And I need to say that when the idea of masks originally came out, I actually wasn't necessarily against them. I looked at the masks and I looked at the rapidity at which the pandemic was spreading, and a part of me thought, well, maybe this will work. Maybe it will provide some effect. And we had early indications. I think it was Croatia who had, masked up early. I stand to be corrected. It could have been one of the other Eastern European bloc countries. But they'd masked up early, and they had actually started the "My mask protects you, your mask protects me" slogan. And I wasn't initially completely against the idea. In fact, I remember actually mocking a Woolworths sign that Woolworths, I must go look for it, I've still got the picture, had stuck outside one of their stores to say that you don't need to wear a mask, but you can wear gloves, or something to that effect. It was the most ridiculous poster you can ever imagine. But what I did, as I've done with everything throughout this, was if I didn't know something, I then went and looked at the literature. I went and looked at what the evidence was. And then I started going into other areas, people like Dennis Rancourt at the time. And I know Dennis has taken a lot of flack. But Dennis has made some very important points throughout COVID, some of which I agree with and some of which I don't. But one of them was about fluid dynamics. And, I quickly cottoned on to the fact that this was most likely aerosol spread and not fomite. Because remember, our initial view was that this was fomite spread. And to explain that to, viewers, the concept is that something like tuberculosis is fomite spread. So if I have tuberculosis and I cough, a little spittle will come up, and in that will be a bacterium of tuberculosis, and I will cough, and that will project usually on average about 50 to 60 centimeters as a maximum, because it's quite heavy, so it doesn't go much further than that. We've all seen this when someone coughs or spits or something like that. You see it coming out of their mouth, but it doesn't go meters. It falls about half a meter from them. And if you're in the path of that, so if you're standing right next to me, well, that may very well go in my nose or my mouth, and I may get TB as a result of that. And so that was the original sort of thought pattern around this. So for that, a mask, any kind of barrier, kind of makes a bit of sense, because if I'm stopping spit from moving from my mouth to you, it makes sense. And so does social distancing in that context. If you're more than the distance it flies, which is 50 to 60 centimeters, it's funny how we got to 1.5 to 2 meters, by the way, because basically it's an issue of the imperial and the metric system. Because what originally happened was the UK said, it's 0.5 meter, 60 centimeters. We should probably go a little bit more than that, because there'll always be standard deviation. So let's go to a meter. And then they went to the States and they said, what's a meter? And how are we going to sell that to the American population? And so it became 6 feet. And then they came back across the pond and they said, well, what's 6 feet? It's a bit more than a meter. It's 1.2 meters.
They met in the middle.
Like so they met in the middle and they went up to 1.5 meters. There wasn't any science to that at the time. Yeah. So that's kind of, but that was the logic behind all of that stuff. And once I came to the conclusion around June of 2020 that this was all aerosol driven. And I came to that conclusion for a few reasons. Number one was obviously the science that was coming out at the time, much of which showed this to be the case. The second aspect was the sort of fact that the way this was spreading, given that at that time people were social distancing, people were locking down, people were staying in their homes, they were going to a grocery store, which was limited in terms of the number of people who could even be in the grocery store. Everyone was terrified of each other, and they were still getting it. So it was quite obvious from real
everything
life.
was sanitized. That's the
That's the
important thing, because
that's
they
a
washed,
separate issue of how, how we got
but,
there as well.
But if it was fomite spread, surely that would have stopped it, right? Because they were so pedantic.
Sure. So that's why the sanitizer, for the most part, is a problematic concept. But so it became quite obvious from real life, from science, from real life, and then from our own clinical practice, because I spent a fair amount of time dealing with COVID and working in a COVID ICU, especially in that first wave. And it just became quite clear that this was very obviously aerosol. And, most doctors knew this as well, because nobody was walking into a COVID ward with a whole bunch of sick COVID patients and standing sort of at the door, which was 20 meters from the first bed, and going, I'm safe, right? Because everybody was under the assumption that the stuff must be at some level aerosolized.
Yeah.
So and the fact that the masks that were being worn, the doctors went straight for N95s. Many of us bought, if we were working in COVID intensive areas, bought even better masks than that, commercial grade masks. And so, it was quite obvious that the masks were not going to be helpful, in my view. I think that's been proven correct. The CDC certainly backs me on that. Now, it's taken a long time to get there. Someone like Professor Guy Richards, who is emeritus professor of critical care at Wits University, has said that, sorry, I don't want to misquote him, has said that masks are next to useless. So Shabir Mahdi, Professor Shabir Mahdi, has also said that he doesn't endorse masks. That was specifically in reference to wearing masks outside. I'm not sure why his views changed for indoors. And so there's a lot of people that have come out with that. The problem is this is a behavioral change that we've instigated. And there are people in places where they haven't dropped the mask. Certainly in South Africa, we're still mandated to wear a mask. I know, many people try to ignore that mandate. But there's certain places you go where you just can't get away from that. Major shopping centers, for example, the security guards, it's their new favorite trick, right? Certain shop attendants love it more than anything else. But in places where they've dropped the mask, many people are of the opinion that they're never going to stop wearing them. And I think that's really sad. And what upsets me most is the masking of children. And the potential that has to cause damage. I have been quite viciously attacked for making that point, and having made that point, I think late 2020, I made the point that we may be causing damage to kids and to future generations. And I remain very concerned. I remain very concerned about how people are going to behave as adults when during their formative years of socialization, they did not necessarily get the same exposure as the rest of us have been fortunate enough to have for 300 million years.
It's interesting. People always, it's the common trope that people make when they hear about homeschool kids. They're like, oh, how will they be socialized? Meanwhile, it's all the kids that went to public schools that ended up wearing masks. They're going to be poorly socialized now, and the homeschool kids are actually going to be the ones who come out okay. But it's the social cues. It's the fact you're breathing in carbon dioxide the whole day, and also the fact that no one cleans their masks. Like, this is not a thing. People don't use a new mask every day the way it's meant to be worn as the official COVID guidance. That thing lives under your car seat, collecting God knows what. Then you put it on your face, and you wear the same thing for 6 months. There's obviously going to be the health effects. People are going to start getting bacterial lung infections. You're breathing in CO2 all day. I've heard, I don't know how true this is, but I've heard rumors that there's been IQ drops in kids. Over the last 2 years, they've started picking this up. I don't know if there's more to that. It might just be a meme, but
look, I think those types of things are very difficult to study in the short term.
yeah,
And I would be suspicious of any study confirming my bias or not. But yeah, I am worried about, anecdotally, I know speech therapists who tell me that they've had issues. There's a lot more sort of foot traffic through the door, and a lot of kids who've got a problem with speech as a result of that. In fact, a family member is included in that. What is the way that you develop emotionally over time? Do we end up in 20 years having more school shooters? Is that a possibility? I don't know, but I do know that adults now don't behave sort of properly around each other as a result of this thing. If I get into a stranger's sort of 1.5 meters, they tend to recoil a little bit, and you can feel it and you can see it. People who are very attached to their masks, if they don't have it on, or they adjust it the minute you come near them. If you're not wearing a mask, you can see that they're a bit fearful. So if that's happening at an adult level, what's going on at the child level? And I'm not saying I know, but I can't imagine that that's future positive. I'm happy to be proven wrong on that, but I just don't see it.
Yeah. Okay, next one. Master crock of shit. Asymptomatic spread. This has been one that I've been going backwards and forwards on over the last couple of years. So it was initially asymptomatic spread was people were like, this is ridiculous. How can you be spreading a virus when you're not sick and you're not showing symptoms? Then the pendulum swung the other way, and I was kind of compelled, but I was like, maybe there's something to this, because it sounds like people are still carrying viral load and are still capable of spreading it, at least for a few days before showing symptoms. Now, I'm not too sure. What's your view on it?
Yeah, my view is that there's no such thing as impossible. So, when you hear someone say always, never, it's impossible, that can't happen, that always happens, you should always be skeptical of those kinds of statements. And there are instances where there are absolutes, but they're seldom. Is asymptomatic transmission a driver of the pandemic? My opinion, again, just my opinion, is that it is not. And the reasoning is quite simple. So is it possible that someone who's asymptomatic passes the virus on? Sure. But for them to do that, they would have to have virus on board, and they'd have to have quite a bit of virus on board.
Yeah.
Okay. Because it has to have entered your body. You have to be producing virus. In other words, it has to be replicating inside your own cells. Because the first time you get infected, that virus that's infecting you is not the virus that you're going to give to other people. The virus you're going to give to other people is virus that's entered and replicated. So now you've replicated virus. Now, in order for you to be asymptomatic at this point, you must understand what a virus does to your body, and especially COVID, especially SARS-CoV-2, not COVID, sorry, that's another bugbear. The virus is SARS-CoV-2, the disease is COVID. So if you're asymptomatic, you actually don't technically have COVID yet.
Yes.
You have SARS-CoV-2. But if you are replicating a virus like this, you will feel or should feel ill, because it is detonating some of your cells. And then it is spreading this horrible viral particle through your bloodstream to various organs, which has the spike protein on it, which causes a whole bunch of issues with clotting, can cross the blood-brain barrier as far as we know, and causes sort of brain fog. So there's a whole bunch of these cluster of symptoms. Now, is there a period during which it may have replicated and you feel sick yet? Because you're that guy who, even when he gets the flu, doesn't really feel much and still goes to work. And you get a bit of a scratchy throat on day 2. Sure, it's possible. Absolutely. Again, is that a major driver of the pandemic? In my opinion, no. And I think that the latest advisory from the government agrees with that. Because they're saying if you test positive for SARS-CoV-2, but you are asymptomatic, you can go out into the world. The minute you become symptomatic, you may not. What they're saying by saying that is we are not particularly worried about spread from asymptomatic individuals. That's at least how I read it.
Yes. So why were they worried before is the question, though.
Yeah, I mean, this starts getting a bit tinfoil hatty, right? Because we don't really know in the minds of people. I mean, I think part of it may be ignorance. Part of it is perhaps a belief that, yeah, Jonathan, we agree. Maybe it's not doesn't happen commonly, but for a virus like this, it doesn't matter whether it's common or uncommon. We want to attend to all instances of spread. Certainly, lockdowns were that. They were not happy with any level of spread. So it's
zero COVID.
And I said to them, asymptomatic spread happens at some level. People will go, well, we're not happy with any spread. We want zero. So that's probably the least conspiratorial answer I can give you on that.
That's good. I appreciate it. Let's err on the side of caution here. My personal view on that is that there's momentum from all these other countries that are just going crazy with COVID rules, and the South African government is just following along because WHO says so, CDC says so. It strikes me that the South African Department of Health lacked the self-belief to act out against that and be like, no, guys, like we don't agree. We're going to go the other way and like not lock down our country. But I mean,
I don't have any insight into our Department of Health, and I'm reticent to talk directly about them, given that I am a state employee. But I will say that on a global level, that certainly does seem to be the case, in that many people, many governments piggybacked on sort of best available evidence, or what they believed was best available evidence from the usual suspects. So the WHO, the CDC, the White House, Anthony Fauci, essentially, the European CDC, certain British institutions, and that was kind of taken to be what the story is, and then they ran with it. There was also advisories, and it's not in defense, but it's just to say that, and I say this on a personal level, and I understand it on a sort of political level, to go against is very difficult. If you are the South African government and the United States, Iran, all of our enemies and friends, and of course our enemies are in the West, friends are all the wrong people, but all of our enemies and friends are doing exactly the same thing, and you're going to be the one place that goes, we've got this, we're going to pass. Thanks.
Hang on, I think I've lost you. You've frozen there. Let's see if you come back.
You got me?
Yeah, I got you. There, you're back.
Sorry, I was just saying, at a government level, did you get to the government level part?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think just at a government level, it becomes difficult. Even if you're against it, maybe you're in a position of power. Maybe you're a cabinet minister who's against this, but there's 5 others who are for it, and you're outvoted or you're outnumbered, and it's easier to just back down because your other option is to resign in disgust. And we're going to see a lot of this coming out, I think. Maybe not in a South African context, but we'll see it coming out in the UK context, for example. Once Boris Johnson is gone, you're going to see disavowalment from a whole bunch of people in his government who we might believe or know to have been part of this, but who will now claim that actually they were completely against it, and they raised their concerns, but they were ignored. So I think that's an important context. But we've also set up institutions where we've seconded responsibility and accountability to those institutions. If there's a war, well, NATO must go deal with the war, or the UN must deal with the war. If there's a conflict, if there's a disaster somewhere, there's certain organizations that deal with that, and there's certain people that are mandated to deal with that, but not you. You don't get to make those decisions. And certain on a public health level, these are giant organizations with billions of dollars who are sometimes doing very good work. And so when a pandemic comes along and they make a certain decision to go a certain way, that's the way you're going to go.
Fair. And that brings me to the next absolute, in my opinion, absolute clusterfuck, and that was PCR tests. So PCR tests, I distinctly remember reading the gold standard of testing in a scientific paper. And this is a really interesting thing to me. So like I would read these papers, and I used to work with PCR tests in the lab when I was doing my thesis. So I'm familiar with how PCR tests work, what you're supposed to use it for. So I was quite familiar with the fact you should not be using it as a clinical diagnosis tool at all. Because if you run your cycle threshold at 40, you're going to amplify whatever you're looking for to the power of 40. You're going to find, you're always going to find it, right? So you at a certain point, you will always get a false positive. So if you're looking for a RNA fragment of the virus, you're amplifying that 40 times over, obviously you're going to find it. So you end up with these very high amounts of false positives. And now we're seeing them walk back PCR tests dramatically to the point where this CDC is admitting that it's not able to distinguish between SARS-CoV-2 and flu, which people were saying from very early on. What do you think about PCR tests?
I think the issue has again come down to details here. So PCR, there's a lot of controversy around PCR. The Coleman-Droston review is probably the best thing to read if you want to see a criticism of PCR in the context of COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2. And I'm not going to really rehash that, but suffice to say that Coleman-Droston feels that the way PCR was approved as a clinical test for COVID-19 and for SARS-CoV-2 was not above board. And there's a lot of detail as why they believe that. As you say, so PCR is polymerase chain reaction test, and essentially what it does is if you had if anyone listening or watching can imagine, if you have one strand of DNA and you then swab a surface and you pick up that single strand of DNA, double strand, but you get my point. You pick up that strand of DNA. If you then run 30 cycles on it, that strand will be amplified 1 million times. So you will now have that strand times 1 million, basically. And that is why it can be a useful test to pick up certain issues and certain can be used in certain diagnostics, put it that way.
Yeah, for presence or absence.
Yes, presence or absence, with an understanding of where your cycle rate starts to threaten your precision and your accuracy.
Yeah.
And so the issue we have is a few things. Number one is when we swab, what are we swabbing? Did I just pick up a full SARS-CoV-2 live virus? Did I pick up a SARS-CoV-2 dead virus? So if I swab a surface that someone with COVID has coughed onto 5 hours ago, 5 days ago, I could very well pick up a dead virion. That virus, in other words, you could lick that table and you would never get COVID. Okay, you could inhale what was ever on that table, you wouldn't get COVID because that virus is no longer viable. But if I swab it and I run a PCR test, it will come up positive because it will tell me the DNA or RNA that you are looking for, I found it. It doesn't tell you whether it's alive or not. It just tells you that it's there. This is incidentally where surface cleaning came from, and a lot of the sanitizer stuff came from, because the initial stuff was done on those cruise ships where they knew there was tons of COVID, and they went in and they swabbed all the surfaces, and they swabbed the glass and It's 3 days after everyone was off the ship. Therefore, we came up positive with a swab. It wasn't a viral culture. It was just a swab, but it came up positive. Therefore, there's virus on the surface. Therefore, it can survive. Now, that was the leap that they made. That was incorrect. You cannot leap from I have a positive PCR to there is live virus. What you can leap to is there's positive PCR. Therefore, there is RNA here. Whether that RNA is functional or not, that you can't say. And so when you swab someone's airway and you stick that in, there are a lot of potential outcomes there because and again, not medical advice, go for your testing if you want to, but my opinion is you could have inhaled some COVID in the shops and it hit your airway and your immune system, which in your nose is very well designed to deal with foreign particles and foreign bodies and even foreign bacteria and viruses, may have been able to neutralize that virus before it got into your cells. Okay, usually using something like immunoglobulin A and mast cells and things like that. And so when I come swab there, I might find virus that your body's already killed that never got into your body. Okay, so that's one option. Another option is, I found virus, but were infected, but your body's managed to fight off the infection, and you've shed virus, but it's dead virus, and it's harmless to everyone. And you come up positive in a PCR test. And that we know because the CDC has come out and said you can obviously test positive to COVID for up to 3 months after the fact. I think they put an 80-day limit on that. But we know that this can happen, and that's why that happens, right? Because your body's cleared this virus, but there's still sort of virus. If I look hard enough, I can find some, and it's not necessarily viable virus. And then the third option is, you've got the virus, it's live virus, you're shedding this virus. Okay, and of course, then there's a fourth option, which you're referring to with high cycle rates, which is that it's possible, certainly, to get false positives. And it's also important to say that you can get false negatives, depending on how you run the cycles, depending on how you run the swabs. So it was never a perfect test. And
especially absence a clinical diagnosis of symptoms. Just taken as being the only data point.
This is a bigger concern is people say, I went and got a COVID test. I tested negative for COVID. I tested positive for COVID. You did not test negative or positive for COVID, and you did not go for a COVID test. You went for a SARS-CoV-2 viral RNA PCR test. Okay? It's a lot of words, but you went for a SARS-CoV-2 test, you go for an HIV test. If the test comes back negative, then you are SARS-CoV-2 negative, and you also don't have COVID. Okay, but you don't have COVID on the basis that you've got a negative test. Now, it's just a caveat to that is that you could theoretically have COVID if you had a false negative. It would be possible if you were symptomatic. So some people say, but I tested negative, then tested positive. Yes, it's plausible that you tested negative because we didn't get anything on the swab, or you weren't shedding anything at that time, or whatever it is. But if you test positive, if you are completely asymptomatic, then because of the reasons I've explained why you can test positive, at that time, you are SARS-CoV-2 positive, like you are HIV positive, if you come up HIV positive. But you, without symptoms, you do not have COVID.
Like you don't have AIDS.
This is like you don't have AIDS until you present with the symptoms of AIDS. So COVID is a disease. It's defined as a disease. And a disease is a cluster of symptoms, usually with a specific confirmatory test. Okay, so we know for COVID, for example, the cluster of symptoms is those things you see on the news. Headache, sore throat, body malaise, all of those different things, and slightly different variants have different, slightly different presentations in terms of symptoms. But once you have the symptoms and you have a positive test, then you can turn around and go, okay, I have COVID because I am presenting with the disease. And the disease is the following things. And so I think that's the biggest issue. And I do fight this sort of battle from a medical side amongst colleagues where I say, we shouldn't be we shouldn't be saying patients gone for their COVID test. Patients COVID negative, patients COVID positive. In my view, we should be saying the patient's SARS-CoV-2 test was positive or negative. If it's negative, that's that. If it's positive, does the patient have symptoms? No, they don't. Okay, so they've got a positive SARS-CoV-2 test, but they have not developed COVID at this stage. Yes, they haven't developed COVID. Oh, they've got symptoms. Okay, they've now developed COVID. So that's the kind of talk we should be having. And I think if the public understood that better, there might be a little bit less hysteria. There's to the government coming out and saying asymptomatics don't need to do anything. There's been a lot of panic by a lot of people. And how can they do this? Well, they're doing it based on that logic. They're doing it based on that logic. They're doing it based on the fact that they've said, well, you've got a test that says you're positive for a virus, but you've got no symptoms, which means you don't have the disease. And therefore, we're not worried about you. Back again to the asymptomatic transmission. So that's really my take on the COVID test. Again, with everything that's happened, we can talk about this with regards to masks. We can talk about it with regards to those screens at tellers. We can talk about it with regards to PCR tests. Sure, there's an industry now, right? And if you were smart enough to buy a mask factory in June of 2020, or smart enough to buy a whole bunch of perspex manufacturing equipment in June of 2020, you would have made a lot of money. And if you're a good capitalist, and I don't know if you say a good capitalist, but if you're a capitalist with a little bit of a wandering moral compass, which describes many people in the world these days, unfortunately, you may say, if this pandemic goes away, if the mask mandate disappears, I will not be able to keep my factory going because I'm selling 100,000 masks a month. And if there's no mask mandate, I'm not going to sell more than 10,000. And so this becomes not a viable option. And so there's an industry of everything. PCR test is no different. We've seen this already. The Competition Commission stepped in. I don't necessarily agree with that, but the Competition Commission stepped in to force the private labs, to force their hands to lower their testing costs by several hundreds of rands. Now, do you think that the test just suddenly stopped costing money overnight?
Right.
Are the labs making a loss now? Were they making a giant profit before? I'll leave that to you. But I will say that if you take the number of people that have had confirmed positive COVID PCR, I did it myself, SARS-CoV-2 PCR test worldwide, and you times that out by roughly 1,000 Rand per test, that's the global cost, you will see that billions of dollars have been spent on this particular testing methodology.
Way more than vaccines. Like PCR tests have made the most money.
Yes.
Because you think about the price of a vaccine versus the price of a PCR test, it's like 6x, 7x,
Yes.
And every person has had dozens of PCR tests.
And over time, the input costs on the vaccine don't really go down, whereas the input costs on the COVID testing does, because the major input costs are two things. One is the machine, which has an initial capital outlay. And the second of that is the reagent that gets used.
Yeah, the consumables.
Now, the reagent stays roughly the same price, but obviously the machine becomes cheaper and cheaper as you sell more tests, or eventually it's free, it's paid off.
And you can store the reagents on the shelf or like in a fridge, and you can ship them easily. It's not like you have to ship it at minus 70 degrees and like have the cold chain and all of that. You know? So
absolutely.
The real money is in the PCR
and in a
test.
high demand environment, eventually, supply will equal demand, and then costs will come down, et cetera, et cetera. Competitors will enter the market, all of that stuff. So it's certainly something I think we'll look back on, and there needs to be a lot of discussion about. I know you want to get to this, but I'll sort of throw forward to it slightly now, which is one of the biggest things we need to do is we need to look back on this and go and be honest about the mistakes that were made, which is not happening just yet. And then we need to make sure that they never happen again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's get to that at the end, because we'll tie it up nicely with that. But This is the next topic I want to get onto is, we can keep going for days on this, but I think we ought to keep it tight. But vaccines, it's a very contentious issue.
Sure.
And initially when the vaccines came out, I wasn't anti-vaccine when it came out at all. I'm still not an anti-vaxxer. I've had many vaccines in my life. I'm just wary of sticking something into me that doesn't necessarily work. And my view on the vaccines currently is, it seems as if they reduce hospitalizations and death. That's looking at the data, but the efficacy is dropping. But they definitely don't stop transmission, obviously. And now the narrative is finally caught up or lost its momentum, actually. And the establishment is admitting that they don't stop transmission, yet mandates still remain, which makes no fucking sense. But what is your professional view on well, once again, not medical advice, but where do you fall on the vaccines?
Yeah, I think, it's very controversial, and it's obviously such an emotive thing, which is very worrying to me. On a side note, just if I can step back from your question for a moment, which is that I'm very pro-vaccine. I probably had more vaccines than most people. In fact, I have had more vaccines than most people because I've number one, worked in healthcare, but number two, I for a long time did aeromedical rescue, and that required me to travel all over the African continent mainly, which required me to have all the other vaccines that you need to get to make sure.
Yellow fever and all of those.
Yeah, yellow fever, some meningitis ones, quite a few others, and to top all of your vaccines up and make sure your titers are good and all the rest of it. So my big concern is that we've made vaccines an emotive issue, and we're going to pay the price for that because we've now created sides, and we didn't need to create sides in this.
Absolutely.
And when we created sides, we may have threatened compliance with other vaccines.
Absolutely.
And frankly, my perspective is that with regards to measles vaccines, for example, tetanus vaccines,
rabies,
rabies, whatever vaccine you end up getting,
the important
all the vaccines
ones
that are to kids, we give polio vaccines, we give diphtheria vaccines. These are all excellent. They have very good safety profiles. There is no such thing as absolutely safe, but they have very good safety profiles, incredible safety profiles, frankly. And they're, in my opinion, absolutely vital and worthwhile. And I obviously recommend everyone to get them. With regards to the COVID vaccine, I think it's a tough one because, as you mentioned, there is a different type of efficacy. So they're not sterilized vaccines. I don't think that's a controversial thing. And what I mean by sterilizing is, if you've taken the polio vaccine, we would expect that you're not going to end up getting polio. It's a sterilizing vaccine. There are obviously breakthrough cases for different reasons there, which I'm not going to discuss now. But for the most part, it's a sterilizing vaccine. The COVID vaccine, because it doesn't stop transmission, is or it at least seems to not be very good at that, put it that way, is and so then you've got to what is so the benefit as per the drug companies, as per the FDA, the CDC, etc., is that this prevents hospitalization and this prevents death, greater than if you didn't have it. I think that is likely true. I know that that's going to upset some people, but I think that is likely true. I'm not sure we know yet how true that is. So what I mean by that is that they say that it's 95% effective, or that was the figure that originally came out, 95% effective against hospitalization. I'm not saying they're necessary, but I am saying that data we have coming out of heavily vaccinated countries may indicate over time that is not the case. Okay. Now, the biggest issue for me is not really whether you believe or don't. I'm not trying to sell you religion. Like,
Yeah.
I personally think that if you consider yourself to be at risk, and that is a personal decision whether you consider yourself to be at risk, you can base it on science, but at the end of the day, it's going to be different for everyone, that you should probably go and get this treatment. However, if you were to decide not to, I fully respect that, on the basis that you should be able to make informed decisions about your health, and that you should not have your bodily autonomy overridden by anyone ever. And
Yes.
that is based on one of the pillars of bioethics, which is autonomy, and another pillar of bioethics, which is informed consent. So, these are the two aspects that bother me the most.
Absolutely.
There will be plenty of time for debate around how effective or not effective these particular products were. But the biggest issue right now is that we want to tell people what to inject into themselves for, inverted commas, the greater good. And we don't necessarily provide all of the criteria which are required for what is considered to be good informed consent. So I'm not saying that always happens, but in at least in many instances I've seen, I don't think it's necessarily happening.
Yeah.
And that I think is the bigger, to sort of focus on the bigger issue here, is the bigger issue.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's what it comes down to for me as well, is that if I do not have full control over my body, if someone else has control over my body, that is to some degree slavery. Because for me, slavery is a continuum. Some people are, being chained down to, row a Roman galley, that's a slave. But someone else is a slave if you do not have full control of your body. If someone else can literally hold you down and inject you with a substance against your will, that's you not having full control of your body. And I reject that as a libertarian or someone who values, liberty and freedom. I don't think that should be happening to anyone. And it's very disconcerting for me to see this like trend in our society move towards people being like, that's okay. And because I'm on the team that, I agree with COVID vaccines and therefore I think everyone should get it, and they think that's okay. But what happens when that eye of Sauron gets turned on them? Because once you've given away the principle, like the quantum doesn't matter anymore, right? And I find that very worrying.
This is the slippery slope, and the slippery slope is real. If you don't believe it's real, then you might have not lived through the last 2 years.
2 weeks.
The reality is today it's, you must take this specific treatment, otherwise you are unable to function in the world around you. And in some countries, you might not even be able to feed yourself.
Right.
And
or see your dying kids in hospital is the latest to come out of Australia, that they won't even let you go to hospital if you're unvaccinated to see your kid who might be dying.
Yeah, the Australians is maybe a discussion for a whole other podcast, but the issue, just want to word this carefully. If in 10 years' time the government does an audit and finds that they have 10,000 people waiting for kidneys, and those 10,000 people who are waiting for kidneys are quite a drain on state resources, including healthcare, because they require dialysis. And when there aren't enough dialysis machines, or just because those people are prone to getting infection, for example, they die. And that's not good for the greater good, inverted commas. And everyone else in the population is walking around with 2 perfectly good kidneys. Why will bodily autonomy matter when they say, for the greater good, we have identified, Ricky, that you are a match with Mr. Jones, and you therefore will be giving your left kidney next week, Wednesday, to Mr. Jones, because you don't need it. You've got your right kidney. I know that
Yep.
sounds ludicrous, but I don't really see the difference. And worse is that if we bend now on allowing people to make their own decisions, and you may very well think that's a stupid decision. Okay, so if you know someone who hasn't taken the COVID vaccine and you think, wow, this person's a moron, I take the vaccine, nothing happened to me, my whole family took it, all my friends took it, everyone's fine, because it does bear mentioning that there are side effects from all medical products, including the COVID vaccines. But even though there are these side effects, they are relatively rare. So you may know many people, and in fact, there are billions of people who've received these doses now. Probably closing in on half somewhere around half the world has been fully vaccinated. Now, if you're really wearing a tinfoil hat, I know some people thought half the world was going to be the world was going to be knocked off by this thing. They haven't been, certainly in massive numbers. I'm not going to get into debates around side effects and deaths, etc. around that.
Yeah, that's another whole podcast.
Sure, I would acknowledge that happens, but again, relatively rarely enough that you could easily know someone who has taken and been fully vaccinated and says to you, I'm fully vaccinated, my whole family is fully vaccinated, all my friends are fully vaccinated, you're the only person who isn't, everyone is fine, you've got no reason to be nervous, and you should get vaccinated. If we get to the point that we are able to bully that person into not maintaining their own bodily integrity, I think we fall down an incredibly slippery slope, and especially in countries with socialized medicine, there is no bottom to that slippery slope. The bottom to that slippery slope is that a committee will get to decide when you live or die. And that is terrifying.
Absolutely. And that's the fundamental issue for me on this whole thing. And one other thing, am I correct in my assumption that this is not a vaccine? This is a therapeutic at this point, a therapeutic with a pretty rough side effect profile, because you have to take it on an ongoing basis. What people in Israel are on number 4 now. And it doesn't stop you from getting COVID. Essentially what it does is it reduces your symptoms. So the argument for you have to, for mandates was you have to take it to stop other people getting it. You have to do your part. With that bullshit. That doesn't hold true at all, because people who are quadruple shotted are getting COVID and spreading COVID, more importantly. But to me, it looks like a therapeutic. It's not a vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, this is a semantic debate, though. So the issue is sure, we could say it's not a vaccine, it's a therapeutic, but what difference would that make? Because at this point, last year sometime, I think the WHO, if I'm not mistaken, amended their definition of what constitutes a vaccine. There are screenshots of that if anyone is interested in looking for it. So they've changed what it means to be a vaccine. And under that definition, the COVID vaccines are vaccines. Under the old definition, there was probably an argument to be made that they may not fit the terminology. I don't know that it matters much at this point, other than to say that if massive faith is lost in the COVID vaccine, so if we get to a point where every country is Israel, and Israel being very well vaccinated has had a big spike in deaths recently, a big spike in cases. If we lose faith in the COVID vaccines, and then that causes people to immediately sort of cross-link vaccines as a concept, and for them to lose faith in vaccines overall, I think that will be the greater tragedy.
Yes.
And that's a bigger concern. We'll get there eventually on what these vaccines technically were, and how we came about to decide that they were vaccines or therapeutics, and what Pfizer and J&J and Moderna and BioNTech and AstraZeneca, etc., what they all sort of had to say, and what influence was brought to governments and to regulatory agencies, etc. That, the truth will out eventually, but I'm not sure it's a particularly important point at this stage.
You say the truth will out if Pfizer has their way in 75 years. So how do you feel about?
They did.
How do you feel about that? Though. They did lose that case, thankfully. They have to release it now over the course of the next 8 months. But initially, people might not be aware of this, but Pfizer was pushing to only release their trial data in 75 years. How does that make you feel?
Well, you know me, I'm not big on feelings, but I would say that there's a couple of things there. There's the non-conspiratorial hat, which is to say that every company sends emails and does things which they probably would not be proud of. I could go into your bank and I could rifle through the executive emails that go back and forth. And I'm sure there would be some disparaging comments about other banks, other CEOs, the minister, maybe the president, maybe their clients. So that's the first thing to say. If I'm Pfizer, I probably don't want just PR damaging stuff to come out, which isn't anything necessarily to do with whether my product is good or bad or whether I've hidden something or not. It's just about the fact that I don't really want you to see inside the house. So I think there's that.
But we're talking about specifically the trial data here, right?
Sure, but there's stuff that happens around trial data as well. Discard that information, or let's keep that out of the study. Let's put this into the study. Let's add this because of that.
Let's say that Maddie de Grey had stomach distress, and not that she is basically living on a feeding tube now.
Yeah. So I think my view is that we have gone over time to try and make certainly randomized controlled trials more open. If you're doing a randomized controlled trial, you're meant to register it, and anyone in the world is meant to be able to go and look that up and see exactly what you're up to, what you're doing, what the parameters of your trial are. I think that Pfizer's data should be open. I think that they should release it to everyone, and that I think it should be open for everyone to see. But I'm also not convinced that when that data comes out, good or bad, it will make much of a difference, because we already have information on their trial, which led to their EUA, which we know makes their trial problematic, to say the least. So absolutely. Taking a control group and vaccinating them, for example. So we no longer have a control group.
Exactly.
So it's not a randomized control anymore. Well, it was for the period of, up to 2 weeks post the study, and then they basically vaccinated everyone. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there. The fact that there was what they advertised was relative risk reduction, not absolute risk reduction. So relative risk reduction is a far less accurate metric of what's actually going on versus absolute risk reduction, which gives you a much better idea of what your actual change in effect is. So there's a lot we already know, and perhaps that data will give us a bit more information. The question is whether there's the appetite to sort of digest that, and whether people who have been fooled in many cases for 2 years have the appetite to digest that and want to go forward and do something about it. I get the sense that 10 months from now, you're going to have people going, we did bad things, we made mistakes, whatever, but it's in the past, and we didn't know better at the time, and let's leave it behind. Let's bygones be bygones. I have a feeling that that's going to happen, and you're really going to need a push for any kind of proper interrogation to occur.
Yeah. And this is, I mean, I don't want to dwell on the side effect stuff because this can go a whole nother podcast, but I think this is where the side effect profile comes in. Because if there are a large amount of people that are being vaccine injured, that's where that push will come from to demand accountability. But just anecdotally, from what I've seen from, there's a couple of Instagram groups of vaccine injured people all over the world. And the common thread that I've read from all of these people's personal accounts, and I've read probably about 50 of them, so it's not a massive sample, but they all say the same thing, that the doctors that they're speaking to are just telling them most of the time, it's in your head, it's nothing serious, this is not vaccine related. And they're just discounting the side effects these people are going through, which, especially in a place like Australia where it's been mandated on you and you have to have it to keep your job, to then be cast aside after doing, quotations, your part for society is pretty cuck. And I think there's going to be a lot of anger because of that. So I do hope people are held to account. But I tend to agree with you. That's probably what's going to happen. They sweep it under the rug.
The issue there is that you need to reach a critical mass, as with everything. And I don't know what that critical mass is. So numbers in terms of the side effects you're talking about are high for this type of product, for this type of drug. But they haven't been high enough to stop anything. There was a swine flu vaccine, for example, that was stopped after 55 or so adverse reactions because they felt it was too unsafe. I mean, we've blown through that.
Day one.
We've blown through that a long time ago. So I don't know what the critical mass is for that, for people to start caring, and for enough of those people to be loud enough. There's also a lot of belief, clearly. So you've got the people who are pro and are pushing the vaccine. The people who are anti are saying things. I don't want to call you anti, but the people who are on the side of maybe we should
pro-choice.
We should look at things carefully here, are saying, well, there's this whole bunch of the stuff going on, and the people who are pro are going, did you notice there's a pandemic? So we're willing to risk that stuff that's going on there because there's this terrible pandemic. So until they kind of change their view, because I think you'll find that most people who are very pro and specifically are pro mandate, so they want everyone to take it and not have a choice. I think you'll find a lot of those people's argument will be, you don't get a choice, and if we've got to lose some people along the way or cause some adverse effects, then so be it, because we're saving a far greater number of people. So it's a risk-benefit calculation. And they, for once in the pandemic, are doing a risk-benefit calculation. In their mind.
No price is too high for those people, though. In my opinion, for them, they want absolute security, and they'll give up complete freedom for that. And then, to quote Benjamin Franklin, they'll end up with neither.
Yes.
But it's
the entire concept of safety is ludicrous.
Absolutely.
You weren't safe the minute you were conceived.
Absolutely.
So, and you haven't been safe since. So the minute you were conceived, there were a million things trying to kill you. The chance of you coming into the world was not exactly 100% guaranteed. Far greater because of modern advances in medicine and
vaccines.
We come from, and vaccines, sure, where we come from over the last 100 years, certainly in medical science. But from the time you were conceived, when you were born, there were a whole bunch of things trying to kill you. There were a whole bunch of random things that could have happened, that could have ended your life or paralyzed you or taken off an arm or a leg. If you've made it into your 20s or 30s and you are intact as a human, you are luckier than 99% of all of your ancestors in history.
Yes.
And the reality is that safety is a ridiculous notion and a ridiculous thing to strive for. You can certainly look to make things safer that are obviously unnecessarily dangerous. But at the end of the day, we live in a society, we built a society where we accept that there are certain dangers, and for the most part, we allow people to engage in any activity they like, provided the danger is to them and not to anyone else. So you are allowed to ride a motorbike. It is undoubtedly a very dangerous thing to do. Personally, not a fan at all. Have treated way too many people who've come off bikes who never thought they would. Treated way too many people who thought they'd never lose their leg as a result of that. They did. And so I'm not a big fan. But I don't want to ban bikes. You want to ride it, ride it. Understand what your risk is. And I would say the same here. You don't want to take the COVID vaccine if that's your choice. You must understand the risk and not take it. If you want to take the COVID vaccine, take the COVID vaccine and get vaccinated. That must be your choice. Who am I to dictate to you? And if I'm nobody to dictate to you, then why is a politician able to dictate to you, or someone else who also has the title doctor before their name and a few extra credentials or different credentials? Why can they dictate to you? Your decisions are your decisions. And when we violate that basic principle, we are violating a very important tenet of our entire system.
Absolutely. So all of the things we've discussed this evening, to me, are extremely reasonable. But you've taken a lot of flack for holding these views, both professionally and personally. Are you able to discuss the cost of telling the truth, and what's that had for you?
Well, the cost some of the people watching and listening will know, because I've been very measured in what I've said tonight. And there are points in the conversation where I've wanted to be more explicit and I haven't been able to. And that's the truth. I am constantly needing to self-censor, and that's hopefully not seen as cowardice, and not because I'm not brave, but it's because there's only so far I can go. We still have a law in this country that says you can be arrested and imprisoned for spreading COVID misinformation and disinformation. So I think everyone to some extent is probably self-censoring. You may go into a WhatsApp group and talk freely with your friends, but you are not going to have that free conversation at the police station, are you? No. You're not going to have that conversation at university or at the workplace or in a Zoom call. So, the reality is that that's part of the effect, is that we've all had to self-censor to an extent. I've been particularly loud on COVID and my disagreement with most of the policies. My disagreement with most of those policies has been driven by an empathy for people who have been terribly affected by those policies. I have mostly not been affected. I was slightly professionally affected in terms of my sort of career progression, but other than that, I've received a salary every day of every month of the pandemic. My comfortability in life hasn't changed very much. I'm fine. But I know lots of people aren't. I know that people have lost their houses and their cars. I know that people have had their marriages crumble, which probably wouldn't have happened if they weren't put into this weird scenario where they were stuck at home and they, couldn't get the stress relievers that they needed, like gym, for example. I know that people may have lost their exercise routines, become unhealthy, and had health complications as a result of that. I know that people may have eaten badly during the pandemic because of this change to their lifestyle, and that may have affected their health. I know that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people who service the tourism, hotel, restaurant industry, who either no longer have jobs, who can no longer feed their families. So I know all of these things, and this is why I have been so loud. This is what I saw coming. The day before we locked down, I was in a restaurant, and I looked around and I realized that all the waitering staff there wouldn't have a job the next day. And in South Africa, waitering staff are not earning money usually from the salary they paid from the restaurant. That's usually a pittance. They get most of what they get from tips. And usually most people who earn a salary in South Africa, certainly on the lower end of things, are feeding 2, 3, 4 other people with their salary. So when I looked around that restaurant, I realized that the majority of those waiters and waitresses would be battling to feed themselves, feed their families for as long as lockdown went on. That hasn't changed.
Yeah.
Now, some people found my views to be unacceptable. They did not challenge me directly for the most part, other than sniping at me, but they did not actually challenge the content of my views. They instead chose to write articles on me, which they paid for to be published in mainstream newspapers, which pretend to be unbiased. Literally paid for advertorials knocking me and other people who made comments counter to the narrative. And that didn't work. And I didn't shut up. And I carried on going. So they did what they always do. This is the left. This is how they behave. They have to destroy you. They cannot have you having a different view. They cannot accept that people have different views to them. They cannot accept the way to deal with different views is to have it out and then let the best person's views win. They will not allow that to happen. So they went after my job. They went after my qualification. And they went after my livelihood in every way they possibly could. I, in some respects, don't want to, and in some respects I can't, because there may still be further legal action that results as a result of all of this. But that's essentially what happened, and I spent most of 2021 fighting that off. It cost me a hell of a lot. It's probably going to continue costing me. It hopefully now in the near future will start costing those people.
Brilliant.
And that I'm not going to. I don't want to get into details, but if it makes sense, then I will do what is necessary to apply the law to bring those people to justice in terms of the type of attack that they took. Some of them they thought anonymously. But in some respects also there's going to be a lot of stuff that can't be done. Media outlets that went after me, for example, there's not much I can do. That's not how our justice system works. That's not how our system works. So they will slowly die, and it will be me celebrating when they announce bankruptcy, for example. But I know I haven't given much detail there, and I do promise that when the time is right, I will give full detail and name names on what has taken place. But it's at times been quite tough. I've had to change my profile. I've had to, as people who've been listening and who've bared with us for the hour and 40 minutes so far have heard, I'm very careful in what I say and how I say it. Because the nature of these individuals is such that they are so disingenuous. They will take the slightest wording that they feel can be used against you, and then they will immediately try and essentially cancel you. And so this is what we're dealing with.
Absolutely.
And that's basically the story.
And I mean, hats off to you for sticking to your principles, because it'd be so easy just to shut up and go away and not fight the fight and be like, keep my head down. But if not you, then who? Because what it's going to take to get us out of this is going to take brave men and women to stand up and say, no, this is not right, and things need to change. And that's contagious. I mean, look at Canada. You got a couple of people who decided to get in their trucks, and now you've got millions of people outside the parliament, and Justin Trudeau's hiding away.
So according to Justin, it's only a few thousand people, but let's split the difference and call it 100,000. I think, I don't expect. I had a profile when this started. I had a profile. I had a relatively decent sized Twitter following. At the time, we were just sort of winding down on the Renegade report, but we had this podcast, and I had a profile. And I don't think it's fair to say to the average guy in the street who doesn't have a profile and who maybe is a little bit introverted and who doesn't like being out there, no, you need to start standing on sort of your soapbox and shouting from the rooftops. But what I will say is this. I can be a voice, and I can be a loud voice, and I can put ideas out there But what's important is that people take those ideas forward. So, if you want to unmask your children, all that you need to do is get a majority, and it doesn't even have to be actual majority. It just has to be a loud enough majority. It's probably about 30% of the parents of your kids who are in school to go to the school and say, we are not happy with masks on our children. The masks need to come off, right? If 30% of parents did that, the masks would come off, whether it be by pressuring government or whether it would be by directly pressuring schools. The reason the masks aren't coming off is because they've got an excuse to make people wear them, and that they're mandated at some level. And there's always one loud parent who thinks the opposite to you, and you're not opening your mouth, and they are. And they're shouting at the principal, don't unmask my child. They're going to give me COVID, and I live with my mother, and she's going to get COVID, and et cetera, et cetera. And so there's no balance of discussion, and there's no discussion about the pros and cons of this particular decision. And that goes for everything. And you can see it happening in real time. So I was against the lockdown from day one. I remember live tweeting Cyril's speech, the first speech he gave, and heavily criticizing him. And I don't think I've ever been mobbed on Twitter as much as I was mobbed that night and that week. And by everyone. There was almost no one on my side. I can name on one hand, when Cyril announced that lockdown, the number of people who were on my side and who agreed with me and were against Cyril. And that's fine. I'm not upset with any of those people. I get it. Many of them didn't have enough information to make that decision. But what's important is now we see the state of disaster. Most people are against it. These changes we've just seen didn't happen because the government has changed their minds from a year or 2 years ago. It happened because public pressure is there. Why can you buy alcohol? You can buy alcohol because the majority of people said, no, we will not take our alcohol away from us again.
Why can I buy garage pies? Cooked chicken?
Sure. Why can you buy cooked chicken? Because enough people turned around and said, this is not acceptable. This is ridiculous. We are not going to tolerate this. So I'm happy to be the voice. I'm happy. I don't regret anything. As I mentioned, I've had these attacks on me and it's been tough. And to an extent, it's not completely gone even yet, but that's fine. I don't regret anything I've done because I can sleep at night. I've done nothing but try and represent the pandemic as far as I understood it with the best available evidence to me. And at no point has anyone on the other side said to me, you know what, Jonathan, can I sit down with you and understand your view? Because I completely feel the opposite. No one's done that. No one's turned around to me and said, you know what, Jonathan, you've got a lot to say about masks, or you've got a lot to say about the lockdown, or you've got a lot to say about, e-retailing not being allowed, or, school closures. Why don't we have a debate on that? None of that happens. And it's not only about me. Maybe I'm a nobody. But at the highest levels, where's the debate? Where's the debate? George Patton, one of my favorite quotes is, he said, if everybody's thinking the same, then somebody isn't thinking. And for 2 years, all of the people in power, all of the people who are supposedly experts have been thinking exactly the same. How is that possible? You take any other subject and you put a bunch of doctors into a room, you'll have disagreement. You take any other subject and you put a bunch of engineers into a room and you'll have disagreement. We highly educated, qualified people do not agree on everything, and take even lesser educated people. Ask them to get in a room and talk about the Kardashians. They don't agree. So, this homogeneity of approach and view, and this attitude of limiting discussion, and we see it now with Joe Rogan. God forbid Joe Rogan has people on who talk about things that you're not allowed to talk about, who say things that are objectionable, who say things that are thought to be wrong. God forbid you do that, because you may not hear the other side. It has to all be the same. And if it doesn't project the same exact picture, the same exact narrative, it cannot be allowed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can't have you on a Bitcoin podcast and not talk to you about Bitcoin. And this is where, so what I perceive to be happening is that the global financial system was on its last legs. COVID came along and let no crisis go to waste. Whether this was causal or they just took advantage is neither here nor there to me. But what we've seen is massive amounts of money printing, and we've seen huge amounts of wealth transfer. The top 0.1% getting phenomenally richer. The Amazon being allowed to stay open, e-retailing being allowed to stay open globally, not in South Africa, but globally, while the mom and pop shops have to stay closed. So you see this massive wealth transfer, and those who are positioned closest to the money printer. So let's take Pfizer as a great example, right? The money printer runs, Pfizer gets a bunch of money to pay for their vaccines. Then those people who get that money spend it, but because they spend it first, they don't experience the inflation, and everyone else who gets the trickle down of that money experiences the inflation until it finally arrives the poorest of the poor, who by the time it gets them, that $1 is now worth 50 cents because you've had such a massive growth in the money supply. Canada has inflated 2020 inflated their money supply by 300%. South Africa has done about close to 40%. The US did about 40%. Every single country essentially has expanded their money supply massively. And that's what is causing, it's one of the contributing factors to this inflation we see that's popping up all over the world. I'm of the opinion that any system that can be co-opted will be co-opted eventually. And this is why I think Bitcoin is not perfect, but it is the best opportunity we have because it is so hard to co-opt the system. And if you, a story as old as time, if you give someone control of the money printer, they're going to run that printer, and they're going to abuse that power. And I think Bitcoin takes that away from them. You and I have had discussions about Bitcoin before, but I've never quite got resolution on where you stand on it. So I'd love to hear your view.
Yeah, I think, for all the people, I assume many of the people who listen to this podcast are very pro crypto, and so am I. I think overall it's a good thing, and I think it's a good idea. And it's still, I still don't understand all of it. I have to be honest, and I think that unless you work with it on almost a daily basis, I think a lot of people don't. So obviously I understand crypto, I understand Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all the other coins, and the blockchain and all of that kind of stuff. But there are sort of complexities. Recently, for example, I learned about DeFi as one example. And so there's all these things, NFTs now, which I had to be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of, because I think the application of them is wrong currently.
I think the application of all cryptos is bullshit except for Bitcoin, essentially.
Yeah. But here's where my problem comes in, and it is an application thing. The thing I would like nothing more than for cryptocurrency to become the currency of the world, okay? Which would obviously give people like Janet Yellen a heart attack. It would make reserve banks. It would make reserve banks completely irrelevant. It would make fiat currency partially irrelevant relatively overnight. And it would prevent what's just happened.
Yes.
Now, there's another side to that, which is that the reason what's happened has just happened is because rich countries decided to lock down, and then they said, but we can't afford to do that. And then they said, we can because money printer goes brr, right?
Exactly.
So the argument from the other side is going to be, but if we were bought into crypto completely, then we would have either had to choose between lockdown or no lockdown, which obviously from my perspective is great. But if they were arguing for a pro-lockdown stance, they would say that crypto would have locked us into a position where we would have put ourselves into an immediate depression, essentially, because we shut down the economy. So we ground the entire thing to a halt. And we needed to print that money because it was the only thing making up for the fact that we closed down all the shops and all the retail, and there was no money going around and around anymore. So that just, it's always important to try and sort of steelman your opposition's argument. So I think that would be one of their arguments for why this has happened and what's happening. Personally, I think it's terrible. It should obviously have never happened. That was one of my early contentious complaints around this, and the reason why I originally joined Panda. What they were doing economic modeling, and looking at how the economics were going to be affected. But I think for me, the biggest problem with Bitcoin is that I have spent 3-4 years getting to understand Bitcoin, getting familiar with it, not panicking when there's a dip, for example, these types of things. And I am relatively intelligent, and so I've been able to pick up on this. Plus, I'm interested, and those are two very important things. I don't think I'm more intelligent than the average man on the street, but the average man on the street may not be as interested as me. So the problem is that he or her may then go, I've heard about this Bitcoin thing, but it sounds a bit weird. Money I can't really touch. It goes up and down, it's very volatile, so not that keen. You're never going to get that person away from that viewpoint until they can walk into a shop and buy a chocolate with Bitcoin or with Ethereum or with Polka or whatever you want them to buy it with. The reality is that there has to be a use case, and the use case cannot be what smart people say the use case is. Smart people with all the computers who run all these companies and whatever. It has to be a use case for the average person on the street. It has to be as simple as cash. Cash is simple. Credit cards are simple. People understand them. There's money in a bank account. They walk into the shop. They buy the chocolate. The chocolate costs 20 Rand. They swipe their credit card and they walk out. And now in their account, there was 100 Rand. Now there's 80. They understand that. It's easy to use. It's functional. Bitcoin is yet to be functional. And I know there's all these sort of examples of, but it's been used here and it's been done this. The reality is there is no great use case where people are in a city anywhere buying their groceries and ordering books from Amazon and whatever else using Bitcoin. And
El Salvador,
eventually wanting to. El Salvador, we need to be careful with El Salvador because I'm very happy with what the president there is doing and saying, and also because he is probably the most based president in the world right now. But El Salvador is a poor country, and
one of the poorest.
And just as in South Africa, you can be in Sandton and be sitting at the Mark in Sandton or the V&A waterfront in Cape Town, across from a Lamborghini and a Ferrari parked there, eating your steak dinner that just cost you 500 Rand. You can also drive 3 kilometers and find some of the worst poverty in the world. And El Salvador is no different in that regard. In fact, it's probably worse. And so we need to be quite careful because the average poor person in El Salvador right now is not trying to buy bread with Bitcoin. There's no modality for them to do that. So even though it's legal tender in El Salvador, and I'm sure there's apps and things, so I'm sure they are coming online, but the uptake is not even a majority yet of Bitcoin, as far as I understand. You can correct me if I'm wrong because you'll know better.
So I haven't been there, and I haven't spoken to an El Salvadorian about this yet. And that's my next aim on the show, is to actually get someone on the ground to speak to about this. But I have spoken to a few guys who've been there, and the fact you can walk into McDonald's and pay for McDonald's with Bitcoin, because everywhere has to accept it. So El Salvador, the bulk, 25% of their GDP was remittances, right? So what they've done is they've enabled the remittance market now to be taken over by Bitcoin. So that's boosted their GDP massively because it was draining a huge amount of money out. And that Bitcoin is going to the poorest of the poor because they're the guys receiving the remittances from their family who've gone to America, right? So, but the point about El Salvador is that it exists now, whereas 2 years ago, a year ago, it didn't.
Sure.
And you've got nation state adoption happening. Which is...
So everything I say is not to say that it won't happen. And I think it will happen. And I can fully imagine a scenario 10 or 15 years from now where, instead of me taking this phone and tapping the credit card machine with Apple Pay, I'll tap the credit card machine, maybe still with Apple Pay, but the currency that will be used will be my Bitcoin currency.
Yep.
Right. And provided a relatively stable sort of Bitcoin price, I can see a situation in which certain countries will pay staff, either state employees or the companies will pay staff in cryptocurrency. I think that will all happen. My concern is with where it is now. It's not there for the most part. And unfortunately, El Salvador is not yet a good enough sort of beacon. I think we really need to hope that El Salvador succeeds in many ways, because what you want to see is that I personally want to see the IMF swallow their words, right? Because the IMF is saying you need to stop having Bitcoin as a currency. I'd love to see Bitcoin go to 500,000, not least of all because I own a very small amount of it, but because that would make El Salvador a much richer country, which if they continue to have a president who seems to want to do good for the country and enrich the people, means that a lot of people will be dragged out of poverty by the success of Bitcoin. And in that scenario, you could easily see Bitcoin becoming very predominantly used. The future is crypto at some level. This is where, though, you've got to start talking about what are the threats, because there's this idea that crypto is bulletproof, which I don't think it is, because you know how you said every system can be co-opted? So can Bitcoin. And the idea that it cannot be co-opted is just very flat, two-dimensional thinking. So yes, you cannot rewrite the code so that Bitcoin can, say, be produced more. You'd have to fork into something else, or so Bitcoin is always going to be restricted, and it's always only going to be a number, and it's going to be harder to mine, and so it'll be more costly, etc., etc., etc. And over time, obviously, because of that, you would expect that inflationary pressures wouldn't have as much of an effect on Bitcoin. But that's not where they're going to control it, because the monetary system we have in the world has many levers which are controlled. So one is the Feds, or the Reserve Bank, and the Reserve banks will print money, and that will obviously cause some of the things we talked about, or stop printing money, and that will cause the opposite effect. But they also use interest rates to leverage things. And then we have big players, people on the stock market, traders, venture capitalists, all these types of people, banks, etc. And South Africa is a good example. We have foreign banks who we know have directly manipulated our currency, causing changes in the exchange rate, which have caused significant economic effects in the country. We're not talking 2 or 3 cents. We're talking a rand jump up or down at a time. And so the same things can be applied to Bitcoin. You see all of these banks going into Bitcoin, and people are very excited about it, and they're buying in, so there's legitimacy. And I agree with that. They are providing some sort of legitimacy. But at the same time, if a lot of Bitcoin gets held by the big banks, all the billionaires, then you've given them, in a way, a lever of power over Bitcoin. Now, you may think that
they can only pull it once, though. Because once that Bitcoin has left them, it can't come back because they can't print it again.
No, I agree with you. They can pull it once. But they can do things like they can manipulate the market, which is exactly what they do with shares.
They can create derivatives.
But I'm also not convinced that this latest dip in Bitcoin and in crypto in general isn't partly driven. So what happens in Bitcoin? You have people buying, and then what happens is it hits a high, and then it hits the high, and everyone's like, "Wow, this is amazing, to the moon!" Right? And then inevitably, what happens is it doesn't go to the moon because people sell off. But that's fine, because a few people sell off, and it's not that many people, because a lot of people, especially when it comes to Bitcoin, are like, "I'm in it for the long run."
Yeah.
But then what happens is a whale sells off, or 2 whales, or 3 whales sell off, and nobody kind of knows who they are, but suddenly a few billion in Bitcoin suddenly gets sold off. Now, it's so hard to believe that JP Morgan is selling to Goldman Sachs, right? And that whale transaction is moving between those two banks, making it look like a whale is selling off. Nothing has been sold off, but enough to manipulate the market, to make the market drop, right? So that they can buy more in, or they can sell off at the right time, profit, and then buy back in. You know, these types of things.
Those shenanigans are happening, for sure.
Yeah. Look, humans will defeat any system you put in front of them. Any system. There is no system that cannot be defeated by a human, yet invented. And the same will apply to cryptocurrency. Now, does that mean that you wipe the whole thing out? No, obviously not. If crypto is a better version of fiat, then so be it. I personally think that that's the case. I think ultimately crypto will be a better version than fiat. And I would rather have the manipulation potential of big banks and big players only, and not have a Fed, not have a reserve bank, you know, and reduce the number of levers that can be pulled. But the idea that there is no possibility for manipulation and control is insane.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. The idea that there's no manipulation on price is someone is clearly not looking at the market then, if that's what they think, because price manipulation happens all the time. I think the argument that Bitcoiners would make is that once that Bitcoin, like I said earlier, once that Bitcoin has left you, it has left you, because you don't have the ability, you don't have seigniorage, you can't print up more money. And that's the thing that the banks are able to do essentially in the fiat system, is they've got access to unlimited capital, and they can print it out. The Fed can, not obviously not a commercial bank, but the Fed can do that. So you can manipulate Bitcoin to a certain, you can manipulate the price up and down to a certain point, but you keep forming higher lows over time. And eventually that Bitcoin flows away from you. And if you're not involved in productive industry under a Bitcoin standard, you're going to struggle to accumulate Bitcoin, and therefore you're going to give away power every time you do that. So it becomes less and less effective every single time you do it. And Bitcoin becomes, and this is what we're seeing, the Gini coefficient of Bitcoin is dropping. It becomes more and more distributed over time. Because what happens is quite a funny thing, is that everyone thinks the early investors into Bitcoin, the Bitcoin OGs, are like really clever and they get Bitcoin. There's a whole bunch of them that were just lucky, that just bought Bitcoin because they heard about it.
No, I know someone.
You know?
I know someone that is worth tens of millions, who literally is lucky, because I think, you know, he bought a few hundred coins when it was a few dollars.
Yeah, and he wasn't necessarily a Bitcoin, like a Bitcoin programmer.
No, not at all. Not at all. He was just kind of a bit more nerdy than the average guy, and so he happened to know about like tech stuff, and this was sort of a new kind of thing, and maybe it could be something one day. Nobody thought what it is now. I mean, when people were buying at a few dollars a coin, they thought maybe it would go up to 50 or 100. Nobody in their right minds at that time thought 50,000. So, and certainly not 500,000. So, you know, I hear that. I just think we need to be cautious, because there's this tendency when people are pro something to block out the negatives. We can go back to COVID again. You know, you're pro the mask, are there no negatives? You know, if you're pro the lockdown, are there no negatives? And so, for me, there's very few things in life, because life is so complex. There's very few things that have only positive or only negative. There are positive outcomes to even the worst things. You know, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl. You know, he was in a concentration camp, and he found positivity there. So, you know, even in the worst of times, there's some positivity, and even in the best of times, there'll be negativity. And everything we do has potential positive and negative. And one of the things that sort of bugs me with crypto is that people who are pro can become fanatical to the point that they will sort of say, you know, there is no and there is no potential for manipulation. I'll give you another example of something that's going to happen in the future. So crypto is essentially anonymous, but still trackable because of the blockchain.
Pseudonymous.
So you can see where it's moving, but you just don't know who owns the wallet. So how do you track money being given to politicians in a world full of cryptocurrency? You don't, right? So we have a situation currently where we've worked very hard in democracies to get to the point where we try and at least identify the majority of money going to politicians and make them declare it, etc. Different countries have different approaches to this. But most democratic countries try to at least have an element of transparency. Now, look, we all know
it's not working very well.
They're usually filthy, 100%. We usually know that lobbyists are sort of in their pockets or they're in lobbyist pockets. These type of things happen all the time. But would we know that Hunter Biden got money from the Ukrainians and the Chinese, which he then passed on to his dad? Would we know that if it had all taken place in crypto? Nope. Nope. We wouldn't know that.
No. But he also wouldn't know that you and I had a transaction, for example, which this is the thing with Bitcoin is that if everyone has got anonymity, I believe that that's a financial privacy is something we should really safeguard because for me the pros outweigh the cons. But
problem with financial privacy is, Sorry to interrupt.
No, sorry. So it's just something you said to me a while back about Bitcoin being religion. And I totally agree with that. Bitcoin is a religion. It started as a cult, and it is now a full-blown religion. It has got its high priests. It's got its apostates who've been kicked out, like Roger Ver. They was called Bitcoin Jesus before, and now he's literally an apostate because he went and started Bitcoin Cash. It's it's got the whole shebang. So it's a full-on religion. There's music that people have written about Bitcoin. There's you're absolutely spot on about that. But I think that's what it takes to bootstrap this new thing that is Bitcoin, because it is becoming a cultural movement. And how else does something become a cultural meme if it doesn't become an organized religion to some kind of sense? So it's interesting that, and this has taken on its whole life by itself. Some dude wrote a white paper and did some code, and now it's become a fucking religion. Like it's crazy that this is what it's come to. But the thing that I'm more interested in Bitcoin is, sure, the manipulation is one aspect that's not going to go away, but that's not a major concern to me. I'm worried about structurally, how do the big centralized institutions, the big banks, World Economic Forum, IMF, how do they structurally attack Bitcoin and destroy Bitcoin and stop it from being effective? Is it social attacks? Is it going after the nodes? Like how would they actually attack it and destroy it? I haven't been able to figure that out.
I think you've seen some of that. I think you've seen some of that already. They've used climate change as one element of attack. Bitcoin is bad for climate change because it takes cooling to do this, and the cooling uses a lot of electricity, and so therefore Bitcoin bad. That's one avenue they've taken. Sure, most things are done on narrative these days.
Absolutely,
things don't need to be real, and they don't need to actually be. They don't need to actually be true. Again, we've just had a pandemic where, for the most part, more than 99% of people survived the virus. 99% of people who get it, for the most part, will survive. But if you ask people what they believe that number really is, you get sort of figures around 50%. They think if you get the disease, you're 50-50. It's a coin toss.
It's like it's fucking Ebola.
Sure. So the thing is that they just have to create narrative. I mean, one of the narratives I've heard from older people, and this, they haven't picked it up from nowhere. They've already been told this by News 24 and the likes. Is cryptocurrency is used for illegal means. Cryptocurrency is for pornography and trafficking of women and illegal immigrants, and it's for crime. This is how crime people pay each other. I mean, that's my whole point. Regarding the, I'm not worried about the crime side. I'm worried about big criminals. People like Bill Gates, paying George Soros. I mean, they'll do big transactions between each other, and you'll never know it happened. We found out that Bill Gates has been giving a whole bunch of media organizations in this country millions of rands, and they've they've been receiving this huge amount of money. Again, we would not know that in a crypto environment, because they could hide it much more easily than they can hide actual SWIFT transfers through banks. So I do think, but again, it's not a. It's this whole concept of trying to create a utopian ideal. Bitcoin crypto is not perfect. Is it better than what we have currently? Yes. Will there be problems? Absolutely.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But is it a better solution? This is the fundamental difference between the left and the right. The left wants to alleviate all harms and all negative outcomes, but it is absolutely impossible to achieve that. So to try achieve it, they harm people to achieve no harms.
Yeah.
That's what they ultimately end up doing, because that's the only choice they have at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're on the right, if you're moderately on the right, if you're on the right and moderate yourself, then your view is that you understand the complexities of things, and you understand that there will be negatives and positives to everything. But your only aim is to try and make the positives outweigh the negatives.
Yeah.
And as much as you possibly can, understand that there will always be negatives. So healthcare is an example again of this. The left wants socialized medicine. The right says, no, we want free markets. In both systems, there will be problems. In which system are there more problems? In my view, certainly in socialized medicine.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's the thing. People look at capitalist countries and they go, but there's still poor people. Yes, there are. But
they have
less
iPhones.
than there would be if you didn't have that system. Far less than there would be if you didn't have that system.
Yeah.
You know, and so this is that's the problem with the crypto discussion is it's never going to be perfect, and whether you're going to be able to, in a very politicized environment, be able to sell it to people the minute a narrative comes about, which gives them a big enough problem to focus on, is going to be the real question.
Yeah. And I totally agree with you on the narrative side. I think the social attack is the weak point for Bitcoin. But the honey badger does not give a shit. This is the beauty of it, is that the people who hate Bitcoin are going to be the last ones to adopt it. And they buy in at the price they deserve. The Adrian Bassons and the fucking cucks at News 24 are going to be the last guys to buy Bitcoin, because they, to the core, believe that it's boiling the oceans. And when the fiat is hyperinflating and they've got no Bitcoin, it's going to be cuck for them. And I'll struggle to empathize. But this is what Bitcoin creates, this situation where it is grounded in energy, essentially, is what it comes down to. Bitcoin is based on energy consumption, and therefore it's money that's tied to energy. And to undermine that, because energy can't be created or destroyed, is very difficult. And for that reason, I think it's the social vector is the attack vector that can be used. But it is very tough, because all around the world, everyone is kind of adopting Bitcoin at the same rate. So you can't ban Bitcoin; you can just ban yourself from it. And that's the beauty of it to me.
Yeah, I mean, I know this is also a very unlikely outcome, but if you wanted to, you could take Bitcoin down. You would need to do a hell of a lot to get there.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
And again, I'm not saying that that's a likely outcome, but I have, and we all have lived through 2 years through things I would have thought would have happened in my life.
Yeah, very
That's
true.
the reality.
Very true.
Through exertion of government power, I didn't think would ever happen ever again, unless countries literally became communist states. And if you had told me basically the whole world would become a communist state for at least a period of a year at minimum, I wouldn't have believed you.
It's not possible, but here we are.
So
yeah,
there are very powerful people with very direct interests. I will just also point out that those people you refer to, like at News 24, if you think they haven't bought in, I've got news for you.
Now they're buying Solana and Cardano and that bullshit. They're not buying Bitcoin.
Fair enough. So you're a purist, eh?
Oh, a maximalist is what we like to call ourselves.
Yes,
but yeah, otherwise known as an asshole. But it's I used to believe in the multi-coin hypothesis. I've just been disillusioned by them over the years. Just not deliver what they say they're going to deliver, and basically 90% of them be scams. And like, yeah, don't want to be associated with scams.
So what's your Ethereum take?
No, I think Ethereum has been recently appointed a World Economic Forum person onto the advisory board. I think Ethereum may well be the attack vector against Bitcoin. because when last did you hear a bad word about Ethereum in any mainstream news outlet? It's always the one that they like trumping. Oh, Bitcoin bad, Ethereum good. And this is something I didn't believe in until a couple of months ago, but like I've seen it play out over the last year. That first of all, Ethereum hasn't hit any of their targets or done anything they say they want to do. It's always like Ethereum 2.0 now got canned and they've got some new fucking roadmap. But they change the narrative all the time. Started out as world computer, then it was like, okay, we're going to be DeFi for everything, decentralize everything. Then ultrasound money was their last thing, but it's effectively controlled. It's just the new central bank is what Ethereum is. It's controlled by people. The rules change all the time. They got fucking World Economic Forum on the board. That's a massive red flag. And effectively, it doesn't solve a problem that the world needs solving, really, which is sound money that is tough to co-opt. So I'm interested.
Contract aspect to it.
That can be done on top of Bitcoin now. And that's what I find interesting on Bitcoin is with Lightning, you've got layer 2 and you're going to have layer 3s be developed, because your smart contract ultimately has to have a financial component to it, because you want to settle funds between each other. So you want to use the most secure system available to you, and Bitcoin is the most secure network on earth. So you would rather build your contract on the most secure network than on one that's rules change all the time and whose gas fees go through the roof. So the smart contracting will come, and it is already being developed. But I feel like Ethereum and all these other coins put the cart before the horse. Let's take Solana, for example, and Polkadot and all these other guys. It's a race to the bottom to see who can build the most centralized blockchain. You can literally just do that on a database. You go spin up an AWS server and you've got your own database there. And then you've got your centralized system. So for me personally, the only problem a blockchain really solves is decentralized money, really, a decentralized ledger of who owns what, because blockchains are really inefficient and shit at everything else. So I don't see problems in the world that need solving as badly as world money. And that's why I think Bitcoin is what I focus my energy on. And I can go really deep on that because I don't have to be distracted about what the fuck Cardano is doing and, why it's important and why they've partnered with the Ethiopian government months before they went into civil war. It's a troll. It's an energy suck. And it's not based on real proof of work. It's based on proof of stake, which is essentially just another central banking in a digital format with a new brand of bankers. But yeah, that's my take on it.
Interesting. See, I'm learning stuff.
It's great. I mean, at the end of the day, people who disagree with the state are going to be cut out of the financial system. The more it gets centralized, the more we have central bank digital currencies and digital passports. And we didn't get into that. I know we've gone way over time. And thank you very much for being for going over time like this. But the central bank digital currency thing, like take Urania, for example. Like those guys, if Lesotho and the ANC had the ability to cut them out of the banking system today, they would. Like they would cut Urania out immediately. And those days will come when you centralize more control over the banking system. The likes of AfriForum will have their bank account shut down in a heartbeat if the government eventually manages to exert enough pressure. And then what then? And Bitcoin is going to be the route that they'll have to take. So, I mean, I've been chatting to some guys in those circles, and they definitely are thinking about this because they know those days are coming. And if they want to keep serving their mandate for their members, they need to be able to pay for things. And Bitcoin fixes this for them. It's not perfect, volatile, all of that at the moment. But at least they can still transact,
Yeah, I hear you. It's interesting. Well, it's as I say, I don't think it's going anywhere. I do believe it has a good use case, but it's going to have to become mainstream, and it will happen over time. But as it stands right now, it's still niche.
So it's still
niche, and those of us who know it, or have at least, I mean, you know it far better than I do, but any of us who have a little bit of exposure are sort of pro, but we forget that some people don't have the first clue, and they can't see any purpose to it, and you can't show them a purpose, And until I can say, hey, can I buy you a Coke? Let me use my Bitcoin. Until I can do that, I know I can sort of do that right now with certain methods and ways, but until I can do it as a very fluid easy
Everywhere.
sort of task,
Yeah.
it's not going to become
Absolutely.
the sort of mainstream view.
Yeah, but it's a great long-term savings technology. And this is how we
I
bootstrap the
agree.
network, you just have to hodl, man. It's that simple. You don't have to people overcomplicate it. You literally, it's like that bell curve of the moron on the one side and the midwits in the middle and then the really
Yeah.
smart guy. And you're
Yes.
like, the moron and the smart guy, like, I just need to hodl. Like that's it. And
Yeah.
that's literally all you need to
Yeah.
do. Because number go up, and you keep hanging on to it for long enough, your kids are going to be really stoked. It's yeah. And if
Hundreds.
it doesn't work out,
Cool, man.
then shame on me. Anyway, Jonathan, thank you so much for your time. It has
A
been
pleasure.
fantastic. Just before we go, where can people follow your
Hmm.
work? What's the best place for people to read your
Oh,
views?
yeah. So I am not officially on Twitter anymore.
Really?
It's the account is at Jonathan_Witt. It's someone called Acclaimed Journalist running that account. So you're welcome to follow that guy. Apparently very smart. Puts out some good stuff. And I'm working on some projects. I'll let people know when those come through. But I want to do them properly. But you can contact me through that Twitter account. I'm sure the message will get passed on to me. And other than that, I'm on the Renegade Report group if you want to come find it. Ricky can tell you all about it.
If they let you in, if you're not a Fed.
Yeah, well, as long as you're not a Fed.
Yeah. All right, Jonathan. Once again, thank you so much, and we shall chat to you soon. Have a good evening.
Cool. Cheers,